being creative about where we can leverage expertise and where we can do that within the alliance framework, I think is just as important as looking at where to pour concrete and where we actually need to build facilities to manufacture defence-related capabilities.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Centre. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And here at the USSC, we focus a lot on AUKUS, from export controls and intelligence sharing to timelines and grand strategy. A critical component and potential vulnerability of AUKUS is Australia's manufacturing capability. This applies not just to AUKUS, but the entire defence industry. And the 2023 Defence Strategic Review cited the need for a whole-of-nation uplift in manufacturing and investment to fulfil Australia's defence objectives. What is the state of play for defence manufacturing and investment in Australia? What changes are needed? And how could the change in government in the United States impact Australia's approach to defence production? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Bronte Munro, an international fellow with Silicon Valley Defence Group and former Women in the Alliance Network member, and Sophie Mayo, a USSC non-resident fellow who works on national security policy at Salus Ventures. Last year, Bronte published a brief with the USSC, Reviving Industry, How the Australian Government Can Be a Better Customer to the Manufacturing Sector. And today we get to take a deeper dive into that topic. So Bronte and Sophie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Mari.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mara. It's great to chat to you both.
And then at the end, we'll get your by the numbers stats. Are you guys good to go on those?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay. Can't wait to hear it. So Bronte, I'll kick off with you. Why did you pick manufacturing investments as the key focus of your brief that was looking into the Australian defence industry?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's an interesting and also the logical question to start with is why talk about it. And for me, I've been in the States almost 3 years now, and a lot of the conversation naturally as the USSC talks about AUKUS, we've really talked about in DC has been AUKUS, and the logic and challenges around reviving shipbuilding and industry and manufacturing for Pillar 1 were quite obvious, and it felt like everyone had a finger on the pulse for that. But a lot of the research areas I'd been looking into was around semiconductors. A couple of years ago, CHIPS Act came out, so we were looking into how Australia could potentially support or engage on that. I've done a lot of work into quantum technologies, specifically quantum computing, all of these aspects under AUKUS Pillar 2. And it became increasingly clear to me that Pillar 2 would actually face very similar manufacturing challenges as Pillar 1. People just weren't necessarily talking about them. So this bleeding edge sort of technology is actually entirely dependent on large scale manufacturing, notably advanced manufacturing. And while we have an incredibly strong innovation sector in Australia across the board, part of the reason why companies kept leaving Australia isn't just because there is more money in the US or is there more talent overseas and easier to commercialize, but it's actually because in part, our industry and manufacturing sectors simply can't support commercialization at that scale. And it was a conversation I wasn't seeing a lot of. And I really felt that the question policymakers needed to ask themselves while we spoke about Pillar 2 was actually whether Australia was simply going to be an acquirer of advanced capabilities from its international partners, or if there was actually ambition and willingness to back domestic innovators and create conditions for participation in the development and production of these capabilities. So that's why I went manufacturing sector and why I think it's actually a really important part of talking about AUKUS Pillar 2.
I mean, I think that's a fascinating point that you make because, as I mentioned, USSC does a lot of work on AUKUS, and a lot of this discussions around AUKUS Pillar 1 is around the manufacturing component, but I haven't been hearing that as much in regards to AUKUS Pillar 2 because so much of it has to do with innovation, so you think of research and development and ideas, but that to actualize those ideas, there's a huge manufacturing need as well. And so I guess hopefully there's a synergy there as people work to problem solve and think through those challenges across both pillars. So, Sophie, you've published work with USSC on defense investment and integration of the commercial technology sector into the national security innovation base. And now you're looking at these issues in industry. Could you share some of your recent observations about how private capital can support national security objectives?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's been a really fascinating few months sort of transitioning from the think tank space to the venture capital world at Salus Ventures and sort of getting to lift the lid, if you will, on many of the issues that I was working on at USSC. And just very briefly, for those who don't know, so Salus Ventures is Australia's largest national resilience-focused VC fund, working closely with Australian, US, and UK investment, defence, and intel communities, as well as the broader deep tech sector to really help mission-driven innovators solve critical problems at the intersection of enterprise and national security. And just one very, very brief piece of housekeeping. I just wanted to say that I'm speaking in my personal capacity today and not necessarily representing the institutional positions or views of Salus. But I think, with a new administration in Washington sort of placing fresh demands on allies to increase their share of defense spending, and prominent Australian and former Australian officials also urging Australia to lift its defense spending, which currently sits at about 2% of GDP. It's a really, really interesting time to be working in the national security investment space. We saw Elbridge Colby, who's the nominee to become the third highest ranking civilian in the Pentagon, which is the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, note in his Senate confirmation hearing that Australia should raise defense spending to a minimum of 3% of GDP. So, against this backdrop, I think it's a really prudent time for Australia to be thinking about how we can best leverage our really well-capitalized private markets to sort of increase the share of national investment in defense through creative public-private partnerships. And I think that specialist national resilience and deep technology funds have a really key role to play actually in uplifting Australian capability in this regard. And unlike increasing taxation or repurposing budget line items from other federal portfolios or increasing national debt, venture investments don't actually come at a great cost to the taxpayer. And in fact, when they're executed well, they can create a flywheel effect and build sort of national capacity in competitive and strategic industries and create jobs and wealth and, a positive demand signal, therefore, for other investors in adjacent fields to lean in. And we've seen this actually with dual use and deep technology success stories in the US, like Palantir, as well as Anduril and Shield AI, who are, admittedly earlier examples of dual-use companies backed by private capital who have gone on to solve really critical problems for government customers. And building on these earlier success stories, there's now a new sort of wave of venture capital-backed startups, or what a 2024 McKinsey study referred to as a third wave of disruptors who are solving challenges for the government in novel ways. So yeah, it's an exciting time to be working in the venture space, and there's certainly, I think, more of a need than ever before for the private sector to sort of lean in, fill critical gaps, and deliver innovative technology solutions to governments who are, in some cases, really stretched and trying to balance competing federal budget priorities.
And so the opportunity is potentially huge if you do kind of get that flywheel effect happening. But what would you say is the current state of play for Australian manufacturing and investment in defense at the moment? And what do you think are the issues that would require the most immediate action?
Yeah, so I would just completely echo everything that Sophie said in terms of the really important role of VC money, but also the private sector writ large in boosting national security capabilities. I think we're seeing that signaling really strongly both in the US and in Australia. I think the key to sort of leveraging all these ingredients, because we have all the ingredients for success, is communication and sort of like that hand-holding between the sectors to learn the language that everyone speaks. Everyone's got different investment mandates, different policy priorities. Whilst there might be shared goals and intent, not everyone thinks the same way, and they don't always have access to the same skills and resources. So private sector investment mandates are obviously very different, and they have different obligations financially in a way that government might be thinking about policy quite differently, and the signals don't always line up. But to answer your question, I think that the state of Australian manufacturing and defence investment is actually in a very transformative phase, which is sort of what I just alluded to. And I think there's strong government focus on revitalising both sectors. But for me, one area that sort of raises alarm bells is actually the education sector and how it relates to national security investment, and the maturity and experience of the rest of the economy and government in engaging with the manufacturing sector. So the economy is not neatly siloed into different parts. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of interdependencies. And in the report you mentioned earlier, that I had published with the USSC last year, I looked at some of the ASX data, which says that even though there's been a really healthy growth in all sectors but manufacturing, which over the last 2-decade period shows that manufacturing is now actually just worth over 5% of Australia's total economic output, construction and finance and education remain strong. And while the numbers look good for construction, finance, and particularly education, what the data actually doesn't show is that as manufacturing has declined, so too has the opportunity and need for these sectors to engage with the manufacturing sector. So education's strong, but no one's really educated or has that practical hands-on experience in Australia with engaging directly with people who are building things, basically, and what their challenges are, what skill sets you need. And so this means that Australia's skill set writ large in engaging with and educating in these areas isn't necessarily strong or limited. So as we think about uplifting Australia, and this is the point that you see in a lot of Australia's strategies, is it's a whole of nation uplift. It's not just throwing money at the problem. It's not just signaling to VC investors that we need money to put into this tech to do this thing. You actually need to hold their hand and go, okay, but we need to increase education in this sector to make sure that we've got the people to go into these fields. Is that reskilling? Is that rethinking the way that we fund public education and the sort of degrees we prioritise? It's also the finance sector, understanding the different needs of industry, different financing mechanisms. So it needs a bit of big picture, sort of blue sky thinking. This is particularly important as we think about investment and manufacturing in advanced areas and emerging technology areas that defence require, and AUKUS Pillar 2 is particularly highlighted.
Can I jump in with a two finger on those really, really excellent points, Bronte? Really interested in that notion of overlap and dependencies. And I think, more broadly, there's a major challenge for Australia in ensuring that we actually have the right enabling conditions to support a whole of nation thriving innovation ecosystem, which will in turn attract more private capital into the dual use and deep tech space, or spaces, which are so critical for national security. And just on that note, the Albanese government recently identified that our innovation ecosystem needs work, and they've announced a sort of landmark review of R&D to unlock future growth, which is being led by Robin Denholm, who of course is the chair of Tesla. And some initial findings point to this well-known quandary of Australia really underperforming when it comes to commercializing research that's relevant to end users, and the fact that historically our business community have underinvested in R&D. And so our broader innovation ecosystem, and venture capital is included in that, is a little underweight in comparison with global leaders like the US, Canada, and the UK and Singapore, which has very negative implications for our own sovereign national security capability that sits in that dual use and deep tech space. So this review that I mentioned, it's ongoing, and I think ensuring that a wide range of views in the community really participate in the consultations for that review and work to metabolize the eventual recommendations which will be delivered to government will really help to support the ongoing health of Australian innovation writ large, but also defence relevant investment more specifically.
I think those are fascinating points, and the role of education and R&D in particular are a bit fraught at the moment in Australia, with we have the international student caps that are placed on things, and that has a significant impact on higher education and feeding into R&D as well. So these are live challenges that are kind of being impacted from a number of angles. Bronte, one thing I really like in your brief is that you propose two very practical measures for government solutions that could help address these issues. You talk about commissioning an independent review of manufacturing and establishing an uplift project office that is focused on skill building. So how did you land on those two solutions, and what do you think that they could deliver if implemented?
Yeah, so I mean, the two recommendations I made, they're not particularly profound in any way, and that was the whole point. Was that there wasn't a need to reinvent the real wheel. It was just a need to sort of like quite clearly say what was needed to sort of take next steps for Australia. And a lot of it was informed by conversations I've had over the last few years in DC between Australia, US allies across, the public-private sector in different rooms. And the number one thing was needing to understand the problem better and just sort of articulating what is actually going on, where are the gaps, where's the front door, where do we need to better understand why a problem's occurring versus, why is something successful in Australia. But the first recommendation was an independent review of Australian manufacturing, and that simply was a recommendation to understand the state of Australian manufacturing, which will help give context to how the government can address impediments to the sector's reinvigoration, and also what barriers were preventing new investment. So in the report, I identified that, again, saying not need to reinvent the wheel, the 2021 Productivity Commission made a submission to the Senate Economic References Committee inquiry, which looked into Australian manufacturing industry, and is really effective baseline assessment of the sector. What I recommend is actually building on the submission's 6 recommendations as a starting point, and think about it more within the national security context and the shifting strategic environment that Australia finds itself in. So it was really looking at it more about what are our priorities in this day and age and what's actually changed since 2021, and actively building that national security conversation into the manufacturing conversation, which again doesn't naturally occur. When you think manufacturing, you don't necessarily think geopolitical challenges and supply chain challenges, and how that all feeds into stability or instability. So I think AUKUS is a big part of that. And it also would act as a signal to private sector that the government's quite serious about solving this problem. And, there have been a lot of, as Sophie said, the inquiry that she's just mentioned feeds directly into this. And it's all sort of coexisting bodies of work that could be pulled together just into one sound assessment of Australian manufacturing, how it relates to national security and what the next steps are. The second recommendation was sort of a mobilisation of that assessment, which was the establishment of an uplift project office that would coordinate engagement between the investment community and government departments tasked with executing strategies that support a whole-of-nation effort required to meet national security goals. So I go through in the report different mandate that would sit under the UPO, where it would sit in government and what that would practically look like. But it was really designed to be a starting point for more innovative government engagement with private sector capital investors to better understand what the guarantees, policy signals, and or investment conditions are needed to make the deployment of private capital more tenable, and to help leverage private capital and enterprise. Basically, it comes back to the idea that government needs to embrace its role as a customer in its engagements with the private sector, and partner to co-develop priorities with manufacturers. So they actually need to understand, what does the investment package look like? What are the conditions that they need to confidently put money in and underwrite risk to support areas that we need for national security.
And Australia, the relationship with the United States is a critical aspect of impacting the manufacturing industry and innovation and all of that. And obviously the United States has been going through significant changes at the moment. The Trump administration recently published their America First investment policy. So Sophie, I'm keen to hear from you. What stood out to you in this policy, and how do you think it might impact national security investment?
Yes, this was an interesting one. I mean, first I'll briefly say, it sets out how the Trump administration intend to address U.S. national security risks from both inbound and outbound investment in the U.S. And so broadly, I guess it's, designed to place greater controls on US-China capital flows, so that more investment is going into strategic industries in the US and less is leaking out into strategic industries in China. And on this, the policy will actually empower the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, or CFIUS, to restrict Chinese investment in advanced technology, critical infrastructure, and other strategic industries. In terms of what stood out to me, I think it's a really good thing that it actually seeks to address some of the challenges relating to adversarial capital that the Biden administration identified in their 2024 National Defense Industrial Strategy, which USSC research fellow Tom Corbin and I have written about in a report that is forthcoming. And so that strategy underscored that adversarial capital investments in strategic industries represent really a huge risk to the US defense industrial base. The US has previously installed programs such as the Trusted Capital Digital Marketplace. And Bronte, I think you and I have both written about that program, which was established in 2021 to try and match defense tech companies with verified investors. But unfortunately, in the years since, I think officials have continued to cite examples of small to mid-sized companies losing control of their intellectual property to adversarial foreign entities through events like acquisitions. So that is, obviously not a great outcome. It's a really positive thing. I will say that the memorandum underscored allied and partner investment in the US economy is a great asset, and channels will continue to exist to support what it refers to as an open investment environment, which is so important to the development of AI and other emerging technologies. And I believe Eric Schmidt has been writing recently in the Wall Street Journal, if I'm not mistaken, about this point, sort of in the aftermath of DeepSeek. And so finally, I would note, because I'm in the venture capital industry now, that in terms of venture investment, the administration has said that it will consider applying restrictions on outbound venture capital investment into the PRC. But it seems that for now, inbound venture investment will largely be left alone. And I think this is because, in fact, the policy says this is because investors in VC funds, who are referred to as limited partners, are generally considered to be passive investors. In other words, they don't have voting rights, board rights, or have sort of any real managerial influence over the fund's investments. So there are subsequently limited vectors for control. So it seems like the administration is happy for this sort of passive investment to go ahead.
That's really interesting distinction and a distillation of the priorities, and I guess how some of the economic thinking is balanced with where national security elements play into it as well, and how they then frame their decisions. And in terms of economic security, there has been a greater emphasis on de-risking supply chains and onshoring production, especially. I mean, COVID was a huge, led to a huge wave of that. But in an increasingly contested geopolitical space, that importance is, front of mind for more countries around the world. So Bronte, what steps do you think Australia would have to do to be more resilient in their defense production?
I think as we think about Australia's defense production, you have to think about playing to your strengths. So there's all the standard things that you can do when you think about can you be more resilient, basically in supply chain. So, there's diversifying local production, there's developing your key industries, there's looking at, micro level supply chains and what are the different nodes in there, what's protected, what it's vulnerable to. You can do all those assessments. But I think as Australia quite quickly looks at how to shore up defense production, it needs to look at how it can leverage its critical minerals and rare earths and what that can do to attract investment, how we can transform that into supporting industries for more advanced manufacturing. We need to consider things around skilled workforces. That's a big part of defense production and supply chain security that, again, I'm quite passionate about, but it's not often talked about. It's like, who are the people doing these jobs? Do we have the skills to educate them? What training programs and partnerships can we put in place now to make sure that once, the capital has been invested and we get, cement poured and we're able to shore up practically and physically different nodes of the supply chain, can the people slot right in? And what does that look like in terms of, I think Sophie mentioned earlier, the concept of creative public-private partnerships. And that's a really important model to consider. So how can we work within the alliance framework as well? So AUKUS, it's there's pillar 1, there's pillar 2, but there's also the role it has in sort of signaling a willingness to be creative and adaptable within the alliance network. And what does that look like for sending people over and engaging with advanced manufacturing in the US to build up that skill set, say in semiconductors, and how does that relate to our quantum industry here that we're trying to stand up? So being creative about where we can leverage expertise And where we can do that within the alliance framework, I think is just as important as looking at where to pour concrete and where we actually need to build facilities to manufacture defence-related capabilities.
And if we think about Australia and its positioning on a global stage, I guess, Sophie, now that you're working in the innovation ecosystem, can you walk us through where Australia sits in terms of global science and research performance?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny, contrary to what I mentioned before about Australia underperforming when it comes to the commercialization of research, we're actually a very high performer when it comes to the quality and the impact of our research earlier up the chain. So as cited in the aforementioned Albanese government strategic examination of R&D discussion paper, Australia actually produces 3.5% of the world's publications, 5.8% of the world's citations, and 15% of Australian publications are in the top 10% of global publications. All this despite Australia being only 0.34% of the total population, of total global population, that is, according to the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. So another positive news story is that we're also really competitive when it comes to patents. There was a report done by the Australian IP organisation in 2024, which noted that our domestic patents actually increased by 2.4% in the last couple of years amid a small global contraction. And the World Bank and the UN have both noted that actually in 2022, Australian patents, as of 2022, I should say, Australian patents are on par with the UK and Canada, which is, I think, a huge accomplishment, sitting at 114 patent applications per million people, in contrast to Canada's slightly more, 123 patent applications per million people, and the UK's 172 patent applications per million people. So where we start to fall down is the number of spin-outs that we have. In other words, where you see talented university researchers spinning out their own companies, their own emerging startup companies from universities. Our numbers of spin-outs are relatively modest in compared to other developed nations, but it is worth mentioning that we do seem to kind of be at a similar inflection point to that of the UK in about 2011, and 10 years later, by 2021, the UK's spin-out ecosystem had grown quite significantly. So I think with some hard work to address this commercialization piece, which this strategic review of R&D will certainly do, or has in train, I think we could really close the gap between our innovation performance and those of other developed nations.
I mean, that's a really fascinating outlook because of the discrepancy, I guess, between Australia really punching above their weight in terms of the research that's happening. I mean, similar to the Olympics, Australia always does so amazingly in the medal count. But then it is that commercialization piece where there's a discrepancy. But if that's a known factor, and if there's a roadmap of where that's been tackled before, then if there are practical steps that can be taken, that opens up a lot of opportunity. That is massive.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that's why you're seeing so many venture investors increasingly sort of dive into the deep tech space, because there is so much potential there.
And another area where Australia is punching above their weight is in terms of their superannuation investment pool, which now tops $4 trillion. It's one of the largest wealth funds in the entire world. And this was recently touted at the Super Summit that they held in DC and New York very recently. So I guess, Bronte, what role do you think super investments could play in addressing the challenges that you both have outlined? And what kind of changes would be needed for this to make a difference?
Yeah, so I mean, Australia's superannuation funds and the pool of capital there is definitely where we continue to punch above our weight. I believe it's the 5th largest pool of capital or pool of assets under management globally at the moment. And interestingly, when I talk to a lot of people in the US coming out of like DAU, OSC, candidly, one of the things I get quoted back to me is, first of all, how big our superannuation funds are, And then it's quickly followed by the question of, so what are we doing with it and how can we mobilize it for national security? To which that I usually answer, we're working on it. It's an ongoing conversation. And a lot of very smart people are very invested in this problem as well. I think the thing to remember, though, when talking about Australia's superannuation funds is that the primary duty of the super funds is to maximise returns for their members. So their capital is the sum of individual Australians' hard work and savings for their future retirement. So it's your mum, your dad, your uncles. Everyone wants their capital invested in something that's safe, that's got long-term stability. And it also doesn't make people uncomfortable, which is where the ESG and sometimes defence tech can get a little bit contestable, where people don't necessarily want their money going into guns and tanks, but that luckily isn't the only way that you can invest superannuation to support national security. And this is where the dual use conversation comes in. And particularly one point to note is that as a lot of baby boomers are retiring, priorities in investing are now shifting to low risk investments. So the challenge is actually to ensure that the projects are attractive and suitable to superannuation funds. So the investment mandate's changing as our population demographic changes. So one thing to remember as well is that you've got to navigate super funds policies and processes to meet their risk and return requirements on investments, which is really important. So governments looking to mobilise super funds need to invest in national security must understand that any investment made by a fund has to come from the bottom up through the investment process, not top down through management strategy or influence. So if the government wants to effectively leverage this, for its strategic projects, then it must develop a way to understand what projects have the best chance of making it through these processes and help facilitate them. So back to the dual use comment, many defence capabilities rely on manufacturing that broadly benefits national security. So advanced manufacturing production, semiconductors, critical minerals. They're commercially viable and essential for maintaining Australia's quality of life. So for the Australian government navigating ESG and other forms of investment filters through that bottom-up process, they're going to have a strong knowledge of how dual use can be framed as meeting that investment mandate, which is definitely doable. And this ties into the recommendations I touched on earlier. So the Uplift project office, one of the mandates that I recommended it have is to help actually coordinate engagement with the investment community and government departments to support the whole of nation efforts needed to meet national security goals outlined in the Defence Strategic Review. So it's actually pulling in people who have a really strong working knowledge of this and sort of holding, again, that hand-holding aspect of making sure that the conditions and requirements of super funds, while also meeting the Australian government priorities and timelines, are aligned.
Awesome. Well, I would love to get your by the numbers stats. Sophie, do you want to go first and share with us your number you have today?
Absolutely. Okay, so my number, this is per Crunchbase data, which is one of the largest VC industry-wide databases. So venture capital-backed defense startups raised, and this is in US dollars, $3 billion spread over 102 deals in 2024,
Wow.
which represents an 11% uptick from 2023, where $2.7 billion US dollars were raised over 100 announced funding rounds. But it's really interesting. I went back to 2019, and that figure only sat at US $0.8 billion. So you can see that there's been quite an uptick, or more than quite an uptick, in investor interest in this area in really a relatively short space of time, which I think can explain the rapid proliferation in specialized national security funds in the US, Australia, the UK, and elsewhere.
Oh, wow. Very interesting. It's exciting to see that growth happening, and we should record this podcast again in like a year or two and then see what the numbers are. And Bronte, what number do you have for us?
Mine's a little less optimistic compared to Sophie's, but I was looking at the Economic Complexity Index, which measures the relative diversity and complexity of a country's exports. And that indicated that Australia is actually now ranked 102 in the world for economic complexity. For comparison, New Zealand is 51 and the United States is 14. So if you look at the Harvard Growth Lab's country rankings for the ECI index, it indicates that Australia's ranking has actually steadily fallen from being moderately complex with a ranking of 63 in 2000 to significantly less complex with 102 this year. Whereas our AUKUS partners, the US and the UK, have actually maintained a comparatively steady ECI ranking between around 6 and 14 during the same period. And China has actually significantly increased its ECI ranking from 41 to 18. So these trends indicate, back to the conversation around manufacturing and why it's so important for Australia to really start and continue paying attention, is that while Australia has, to be fair, always had a comparatively lower ECI because we have very strong primary industries, which account for a large portion of our exports, unlike our allies and strategic competitors, we've actually not prioritized the growth or maintenance of our manufacturing sector, which is a significant contributor to economic complexity. So it's not just a policy assessment. It's not just general observation. The numbers indicate that we have been sliding backwards here. And while we've got some things in the pipeline coming out with support from government to improve this, it's definitely an area we should continue to focus on as a nation.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I love looking at the economic complexity index. And when I saw it drop to 102, I saw, we're behind Bangladesh now. We're behind a lot of developing countries around the world, because that would be about halfway down the list of all the countries globally. So, but in other measures, Australia does quite well, but there's just a massive discrepancy when it comes to the manufacturing side of things. Well, that was a very fascinating discussion. Thank you both so much for joining us. For anyone who's listening, if you like what you heard today, please make sure to check out Bronte's brief, Reviving Industry, How the Australian Government Can Be a Better Customer to the Manufacturing Sector, on the USSC website at ussc.edu.au. And I'd also like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, hosts the Asia Chessboard podcast. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our 2024 Election Watch series. And you can find these on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Bronte and Sophie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Maury.
Thanks.